The same problems that people of that age, the first time workers, 14 to 22 or whatnot, 15 to 22, have are the same problems that I have today at 47, which is balance. How much do I have for me left over when I'm done giving away to others?
Welcome to the Sandstone Care Podcast, where we help teens, young adults, and their families overcome the challenges that come with substance use, addiction, and mental health conditions. Welcome to the Sandstone Care Podcast with me, Clint Malley. Today we're talking about the hospitality and the restaurant industry. And if you're like, why are we talking about these things? Well, it's because addiction or substance abuse and mental health seem to run rampant within this industry. It's a challenge, and we're going to talk about why. And if you know somebody who's facing addiction or substance use or mental health challenges and they're in the restaurant or the hospitality industry, hey, we got a resource for you. Today, we're talking with Melinda Dorn, and she's the Industry Peer Support Specialist and Outreach Coordinator for the Culinary Hospitality Outreach and Wellness organization, right? It's also called CHOW, which is fun. It's a locally based nonprofit in Colorado, whose mission is to connect restaurant and hospitality workers with resources to support recovery and mental health. Their goal is to create a community where folks can share successes and struggles in life and at work. So you can hear new ideas, you can take a pause, or you can just reconsider what really matters in life. So Melinda, thank you so much for joining us here on the podcast today.
Thanks for the invite. I'm happy to be here.
So we're going to kind of break these different domains of restaurant and hospitality down a little bit. And we're going to start with addiction or substance abuse. So, why are there so many people who struggle with addiction or substance abuse in the restaurant industry specifically?
Well, let's talk about the term addiction first and define it, as the clinicians do, as a repetitive behavior despite negative consequences. So the question to ask us isn't why is there so much substance use in the restaurant industry, but what do people who use substances get from it, who work in the restaurant industry, right? So when we're talking about relief from pain, when we're talking about relief from the everyday trauma, facing the microaggressions that we do in the restaurant industry as servers and as workers in the food service industry, we're often using substance use to cope with difficult feelings that we don't have an opportunity to off or discharge anywhere else but in the bottle or in the needle, right?
So, yeah, and when I'm thinking about the restaurant industry, I'm thinking about sometimes you're working odd hours. Sometimes you're interacting with people. It's a customer service based industry on a daily basis. And I could see how there'd be like a lot of situations in which you have to do something to deal with how you're feeling, right? So I remember, when I was a server and I was a terrible server, that one day, after working like a whole shift, I made, I think, $18 in tips. And I just went into my car and was like, put my head on the steering wheel. I was like, oh my God, this is terrible, right? Like, it was a really heartbreaking day for me. And so, what you're saying is like, hey, people are trying to deal with specific microaggressions, is what you called it, or traumas that are unique to the restaurant industry. Can you flesh out what you mean by these microaggressions or, these traumas?
Absolutely. So even before COVID, right? COVID has decimated the restaurant industry and the hospitality industry. It's really, unfortunately, brought out some of the worst in people, the patrons of our restaurants, the customers who come in and want things how they used to be. And we unfortunately can't provide that experience for them at this time, right? So we were talking about masculine harassment, right? Where servers are being asked to take down their mask, for instance, so that a customer can determine how to tip, right? Which reduces a human being down to what they look like, right? It creates what was a hospitality environment where we provided an experience and a meal and a memory for you to a transaction where I pretend to be nice to you for an hour, you pretend to treat me like a human being for an hour, and then based upon how well I produced or performed for you, you tip me, right? So that's just the front-facing part of the restaurant industry, and that's what I mean by microaggressions, right? Basically reducing us to less than human, right, in order to determine how you'll compensate us for the experience we deliver. And that's hard. That's hard to take, to go home from a day, a shift, whether it's 4 hours, 6 hours, or 12 hours of facing a community of customers who see you as less than human is often, it'll wear on you. It'll wear on you over time. You might have the resiliency in your youth, as I did, to take that for many years in a row, right? And continue to return to the restaurant industry despite the negative consequences, right? How that wears on our mental health, which I know is what's coming up next. But that is sort of the environment we're facing now. And it's on top of an environment we had pre-COVID, right? Which is, and a lot of people don't know this, but the restaurant industry itself is built on the backbone of the military brigade system. So there's a hierarchy there. You learn what's acceptable behavior. You learn to leave your personality and your human problems at the door and become almost mechanical. And you answer to the person above you and the person above that and the person above that. And the weight of the hierarchy on the little guy in the restaurant industry is another reason why we often turn to the quickest and easiest coping strategies, which include drugs and alcohol, codependent relationships, self-harm, and other forms like, shopping, video game addiction, those sorts of things.
Yeah. And, you have firsthand experience, as you kind of alluded to. Can you tell us just a little bit about your experience in the restaurant industry and how that made you want to kind of seek out this work that you're doing now?
Absolutely. So, and this is where we start to talk about mental health a little bit. So I was raised in an addicted and dysfunctional family. My father was an alcoholic and my mom struggled with undiagnosed mental illness. She would have, had she seen a doctor, probably been diagnosed with anxiety disorder. She's today still struggling with OCD. So in my very young age, even before substances entered my life, work entered my life. I used work to moderate my mood and my mind. When things were awful at home, I'd go to work and I'd find a different environment and people around me who I saw as acting in a more functional way than my biological family did. So I started using work as an escape very early in my life. Well, what occurred next was the fact that many of the people in the industry, I found out, relaxed and coped with the stress of the job through drugs and alcohol. And so I picked up the drugs and alcohol before I was even 16 from the people that I worked with, because I wanted to be like them. I wanted to do what they did. We even see biographies inclusive of Anthony Bourdain, who took his life in 2018, talk about how he wanted to be those cooks with the gnarly hands and the scars, and it was like, I want to be one of those pirates, right? And that's what I wanted. So that's what I went after. I went to culinary school and I got out and I started working in restaurants around the country and ultimately abroad. And what I found was that the circumstances were very much the same no matter where you worked. You knew your place, you knew what people wanted to see from you, you knew how to deliver on the goods, and in return, you got to be part of the big old pirate ship. And that was my family for 25 years. Funny thing is that, and I identify now as a woman in long-term recovery, is that once I started to take the blinders of drugs and alcohol off, I started to see how I had repeated the same dysfunction of my biological family in my workplace. I looked to the captains of the ship as father figures. I looked to, my comrades on my fellow pirates as brothers and sisters, and realized ultimately, after a long period of time, I wasn't in the business for the right reasons. And I'm so glad now that I see it clearly, that people can get into this business with a desire to create art, to express themselves through food, to create a community of people around them who support them through work and life circumstances, that is a potential for the future of the industry. For anybody who's listening right now who wants to become a chef, as long as you know your reasons for getting in the industry and it's not to escape a family situation, you're going to prosper in this business, because true art, true creativity, sustainable food, food made with love, you will be compensated for that. You will get recognized for food that comes from a place like that.
Yeah, when you're talking about this whole pirate ship, I like that metaphor. It's like really helpful for me to think about. It reminds me of initiation, that all cultures that have been established for a while have some sort of rite of passage for the people who are in that community, right? And one of the challenging things about, American culture is that we are a melting pot, and oftentimes there isn't a set rite of passage for people, for men, for women, for teens, for young adults, right? And so work becomes that kind of rite of passage thing. And as you were talking about your process in the restaurant industry, I was thinking about myself. You come in there and there are these people who are older than you, and so much of the restaurant industry is based upon their approval of you, whether or not you get the good shifts, whether or not you get a good table, right? Whether or not you get to work and all, right? And so the first part is you wanting to please these people who are older than you, who've been there longer than you probably, and who have power, right? And then the second part of that I heard you say is that, okay, if you do win their approval, well, part of the revelry of that situation often revolves around substance use. Is that right?
Yep, you hit it right on the head there. One of the things that I recognized is how I treated the people who were under me. So I spent 25 years in the restaurant industry, and I realized that rather than look at the hoops I had to jump through to get approval and say, I'm not going to do that to the people underneath me, I'm going to treat them differently than I was treated. Instead, I had this kind of mindset of, I survived it, so they can too. And I actually passed on some of the abuse that I faced coming up through the ranks, because I wasn't looking at my own behavior, right? It's easy to get distracted in the restaurant industry, be thinking about the next event that you have to prepare for. You could be thinking about the next review you're going to get. And you often forget to look around and recognize the fact that you're in a small, cramped, hot, dangerous environment with human beings, right? Not machines. So absolutely, what you talk about, that lack of ceremony in a life, right? Like, we grow up as kids, we get rewarded. Oh, you walked for the first time, you tied your shoes for the first time, you got out of grade school, you got out of middle school. There's these ceremonial sort of recognition of the next level for you. But it often outside of work, but outside of promotions inside of a workplace, we often forget to celebrate that every day is something worth celebrating. You got through another day, hooray, right? But outside of work, we often we forget to celebrate the little things.
That's so important. And one of the things that makes me think, our listeners know I was a former educator, is that we spend so much of our life as we go through our grade school trying to earn grades, right? And in the process, of course, we're trying to earn our peers' approval. And then when you go into the workplace, there's not that same set of grades, right? There's nobody who's giving you an A or a B at the end of every week, on every assignment, on every shift. And so what becomes the way in which you kind of measure yourself is the approval or the disapproval of the people around you, right? So when I was a teacher, we talk about, okay, you do good work because it's something that you care about and you value learning and you want to learn new things, not for a grade, right? I hated the phrase hey, is this going to be on the test, right? But what happens is that then when we get into these situations in which we feel like we want to know how we measure up around the people around us, that we're going to exhibit the behaviors that we feel like are going to get the response that we want to get the good grade. And what was interesting about what you said is you talked about passing on kind of that trauma, right? That hey, I went through this, and if I went through this, then you need to go through this too. And when I think about cooking shows, or when I think about, famous chefs, or, what's Gordon Ramsay, like, he's famous for how he speaks to other people in the kitchen, right? Like, as kind of this, this very stern, this angry demeanor. And so that kind of like brings us into mental health. And we're thinking about mental health, especially in the restaurant industry. How does that environment cultivate a sense where we can have these traumas, not on the front end, but even on the back end when it comes to being in the kitchen and mental health?
Absolutely. So one of my worst experiences in the restaurant industry include a sous chef. And for those of you who aren't familiar with the language of the kitchen, the sous chef is the one, sous means under, it's right under the top dog, right? This sous chef could bring a person who'd been through war to their knees by just hissing these like most despicable things, right? They never even had to raise their voice. It was just this sort of lack of approval, this rescinding of value from that person, right? And that goes on. So the Gordon Ramsay yeller screamer, that's becoming less and less popular because this is a litigious society, right? We can sue for workplace harassment, workplace violence, and things like that. So chefs are becoming more and more careful of how they reprimand their staff in the back of the house and in the front of the house as well, right? The screaming, yelling, throwing chef. The audience who's listening today, if they're getting into the restaurant industry in 5 or 6 years, may never face that. But what we face is these little tiny traumas, right? These little microaggressions that chip away at our sense of self-esteem and our ego, right? Through tiny little criticisms, right? Criticisms that aren't constructive, that don't help us learn and grow, but that actually tear down the fabric of who we are. And, a lot of people, when they come into the restaurant industry, they're seeking an identity, right? They're seeking a, who am I inside of these four walls? Am I good at what I do? Am I learning? Am I valuable? Am I a part of the team, or am I an outsider? That sort of thing. And so the tiny little quiet criticisms over the period of a long enough time, including criticisms from outside, right? The restaurant's enemy right now is anybody who uses Yelp, right? Because when you are already struggling to keep your employees paid, and you're already struggling to keep your dining room full, right? A single Yelp review can ruin you, right? And it's the same in the back of the house. A single, are you kidding me? This is what you're going to serve right now? Like, look at this temperature. This isn't cooked right. Do it again, right? Like, it doesn't have to be a scream to chip away at your self-esteem and to make you wonder, why am I here? What am I doing here? Right? Do I belong? Which is a human desire. We all want to belong. So yeah, I'm not sure if I answered your question, but that identification of that old way, the non-productive criticism, the attack of a person versus the work that they do, the over-identification of somebody with how well they've produced or performed. That's what we hope to see rooted out of the industry by the time that your listening audience gets there.
Yeah, gosh, it reminds me of so many things that I saw within education, but one of the things that was really hard for me was that when you're giving a lesson and you're teaching kids, there is instant feedback, right? Like, right away whether or not students are engaged with what you're saying, and if they're understanding and absorbing the content. If that kid at the back of the class has his head down, he's probably not paying attention, right? Like, you can read facial expressions. And within the restaurant industry, I could see how it could be the same thing. Any industry in which you are constantly getting feedback from your customer base can be a very challenging thing, right? And it's because, one, like, it can be helpful and it can make you feel super good on days in which you're getting positive feedback. And then you start to validate your sense, your identity, who you are based upon that feedback, right? And then on the other hand is that all it takes is one interaction to be able to negatively impact how you feel, regardless of your job the rest of the 99% of the day, right? Like, it takes one interaction, especially if you care about it. And so until you said that, when you talked about, hey, like you have this almost instant feedback, this daily feedback where you're presenting art or something that you're putting your heart into, your effort into, on a daily and hourly basis. And sometimes that's thrown to the whim of other human beings who you definitely cannot control. I could see how that could be an environment that's super challenging for somebody, especially when they don't have the tools needed to be able to kind of regulate their own emotions or to internalize or to understand that. So like makes all the sense. I want to kind of also show some love for this hospitality industry. And first, I was hoping if you could tell me, when we talk about the hospitality industry, what do we mean? Are we talking about hotels? Are we talking about other things? Like, what does that mean?
Right. Well, I'm glad that you're kind of steering it in that direction, because there's a lot of great things about the hospitality industry and the restaurant industry, right? It will take you wherever you want to go. I have traveled here and abroad working as a chef in restaurants. There's always some place you can go. There's definitely upward progression in the restaurant industry to eventually one day be your own owner, your own chef, your own boss, that kind of thing. There's definitely potential in the restaurant industry to exercise your creative outlets and to earn recognition and praise from your fellows. And there's a lot of great things about the restaurant industry. I don't want to paint it as all bad. So, not, and it's important, yeah, like you said, to recognize hospitality. What does it mean? So the word restaurant actually comes from a word meaning restorative. And restaurants were places, especially in Europe, where travelers, sojourners, would stop to restore themselves along the long and arduous journey that was travel back in the day. Hospitality is that sense of welcome. Like we are saying, you're now here. You're invited to be wherever your feet are. You're invited to slow down. You're invited to be a human being again and not a traveler. You're a being, not a doing, when you're in a hospitality environment. And that could include hotels, right? We're talking about how well appointed a room is. What are the fixtures? Is the environment safe? Can you relax? Are you off guard, right? Like, because often many of us travel through life on guard, waiting for the next calamity to occur, right? It's usually a sort of a measure of serenity, right? When we sit down at a table and we unfold the napkin over our laps and we touch the table, right? We're engaging all five of our most accessible senses, right? But hospitality goes beyond those five senses, where we've got sight, taste, touch, smell, and hearing. Now we start talking about, is there soul in that food? Is there love? Is that bread baked with love, right? These are the non-tangible senses that we human beings need more often to explore. Is there a sense of connection with the person I'm sitting across the table with? So a hospitality professional is going to create an environment where that connection can be fostered. It's not, hi, my name is Becky and I'm here to serve your table tonight. At the end, I hope you give me a good tip. That's service, right? And in the United States, service workers have become servants, right? Where, again, we've got that sort of classist thing where this person who's serving me is beneath me and they're lucky I'm going to throw them a few dollars at the end of the meal, right? In true hospitality, we see each other's as equal, creating this sort of environment where connection can be explored, and it's safe and it's healthy and it's equal. It's based on equanimity, right? And that's where we've kind of taken the ball and run a little too far with it, and so it's kind of collapsed on itself, right? This house of cards we've built in hospitality, where in France you might have 16 cooks in the back of a kitchen cooking for 150 guests. That's one cook for every 10 guests. Here in the United States, we get 3 cooks cooking for 500, and do the math, right? That's not how the restaurant industry was meant to run, on as few members in the back of the house as possible, serving as few members as possible in the front of the house.
Wow. So you just completely, shifted my paradigm of what it means to be in the hospitality industry. And I want to make sure I'm kind of hearing this right. So on the one hand, when we think about the hospitality industry, we think about, somebody who's creating an environment that's engaging the senses, all of the senses for a person, right? And then on the other hand, it's also about creating an environment that fosters connection, and allows somebody to be able to be treated as a human being and not as an object. And is that, first of all, is that pretty accurate to what you mean?
Yeah, what you're describing is the Cheers effect. So, for audience members who aren't familiar with Cheers, it was based around a food and beverage environment, a bar specifically in Boston, where I think it was in Boston, where when people came in, they were known by name. They weren't, hello, ticket number 149. They were Norm, right? And people in that environment were glad to see them. It generated a sense of familiarity with one another. You weren't a customer, you were an actual guest of the person behind the bar serving your cocktail or the person serving your food from the kitchen. That sort of guest feeling, that community sense versus transaction. You're a number, give me your money, I'll give you your food.
Yeah. And so, based upon that definition, I feel like when we think about hospitality, that there's so many more industries than we typically think of, right? In that regard, educators would be in the hospitality industry. I think about therapists or counselors are in the hospitality industry, right? Like these are people who are trying to foster genuine connections with people to make them feel like human beings because they are human beings, right? And it's more than just kind of like, hey, I'm doing a service. I'm trying to connect with you. I'm trying to make you feel human. I'm trying to help you make your day better, right? And whatever service that entails. And on the flip side of that, it also feels like a lot of pressure, right? Like that feels like a lot to live up to if you're in an industry like that.
Absolutely. And it is, right? It's really calling out our best selves on a daily basis. And we can't be our best selves when we're in process of recovering from traumatic childhoods or traumatic day-to-day experiences like historical trauma or cultural trauma, collective trauma that's happening even right now. So in this conversation, I'm actually coming to this awakening right now as we speak. If restaurants are meant to be restorative, right? Hospitality, the word's based on hospital, is where we recover. So hospitality is we're recovering who we are by letting go of what we do when we enter that space. So whether it's therapy or education, right? And correct me if I'm wrong, educational environments, we want them to be hospitable so the children can put down or the youth can put down or the students of any age can put down the outside world for a while and be in this container of space where instead of a son, a daughter, a mother, a father, a sister, a brother, a partner, a server, whatever you are, you can put that down and here you are a learner, right? You're recovering your natural desires to be curious. You're recovering your natural desires to be inquisitive and to learn, right? And so, if restaurants are restorative and hospitality environments are recovery oriented, where we get to recover who we really are in those places. Yeah, there's pressure on bringing your A game as a server, as a chef, to do your best every day. And so one of the things that CHOW does is create a space where those people who are working to bring their A game to others every day have a place where they can be restored, where they can experience recovery, where they can be recognized as more than their title of chef or manager or bartender or sommelier or et cetera, et cetera. Not to jump tracks there, but
No, you're good. Yeah. And so I want to focus on two different populations, right? And they're both unique, right? Like one is about age and one is really about like race and cultural background, right? So when we think about the hospitality industry and we think about many entry level positions, we know that people who are still learning the language, who are first generation immigrants, who are just generally in the restaurant industry, that oftentimes these will be people of color or people from different cultures or people who have immigrated from a different country, right? And I'm wondering if you can, kind of shed some light on not only do we have specific traumas, specific challenges that you have to deal with as a human being who's a person of color when you're coming into the restaurant or the hospitality industry, but then on top of that, like you're in the hospitality industry, you're in the restaurant industry. So can you speak to any of the challenges, with your organization that you've seen specifically with people who are, first generation immigrants or who are people of color?
Yes. And, I need to preface this by saying these are my personal opinions, not opinions of CHOW. So me, Melinda Dorn, I say one of our challenges at connecting with all members of the hospitality and all members of the restaurant community is the fact that there are language barriers and there are ingrained racist, classist, sexist, colonialist paradigms at play in the restaurant industry. I'm not an expert on this. There are some very well learned people who can speak to this more skillfully than I can. But in my experience, which is the only thing I'm an expert of, I can say that a good 50% of my staff in the past have been from foreign countries, whether we're talking people from Haiti, people from Russia, who are here in this country working on work visas, or whether or not they're undocumented professionals coming from Latin American countries. The stigma of mental health, the stigma of recovery is very strong in those communities. And so talking to workers about maybe what keeps them driven for 2 or 3 jobs at a time, what keeps them driven in the sort of you're only as good as you produce or perform for us. If you don't like this job, you can get out. We'll hire another person who's willing to work for less. These are abuses that have gone on in the system of restaurants that I've worked in since I started working in them back in the 90s. So what I call my call to action to all chefs and all restaurant owners is to recognize that abuse and stop, right? Start paying people equally. Don't look at people as dispensable, like that you could hire another person the next day. Don't look at people just because it's always been this way as only worth the $2.30 an hour they get as a server, and that all of their salary is made up by the customers rather than the actual employer of the restaurant. There's absolutely things you can change tomorrow, and then there's some things that are going to take a while to change, possibly even generations to change, that are built into the structure of hospitality in the U.S.
Yeah, and in my experience, when and you're going to see this in any industry, right? I think it's important to preface that gender inequality, racial inequality is kind of a lens in which you see everything, right? There's not just one industry that's affected by that, because it affects everything in our life, right? And so I just think it's important for listeners or for viewers to be able to say, okay, hey, this is a challenging environment. First, step one, right? And then also, if you're a female, if you're a person of color, if you're a first generation immigrant or an immigrant or a family of immigrants, then that's going to be another factor that you're going to have to encounter when you're in this industry. And so all that to say, hey, this is really important. And just to make it even more fun, let's talk about the specifics of age groups, right? So teens, we know that the legal work age in the United States is, I believe, 15. Is that right?
Yes, in most states. Some are less, and it depends on whether or not the food service that we're talking about is an agricultural job or not. Because if it's an agricultural job, it may start younger.
Okay, so even younger with agricultural jobs, right? So the teen years is almost like, hey, now I'm going to get a job, right? That is a pretty standard thing that happens to teens, right? And that young adult area. So if we're thinking about 18 to 30, a large population of people who are working in the hospitality industry fall within that category, right? Probably less than senior executives at, an e-commerce store, right? So the point is that, can you speak to the specific challenges for teens and young adults when it comes to working in the restaurant or the hospitality industry?
Sure. This one's going to take a second for me to really digest. So the same problems that people of that age, the first time workers, 14 to 22 or whatnot, 15 to 22, have are the same problems that I have today at 47, which is balance. How much do I have for me left over when I'm done giving away to others? So whether that others means schoolwork, or whether that others means family obligations, or whether that others means work, right? What am I saving for me at the end of the day, so that I don't feel so empty and tapped out that I'm going to reach for anything to fill me back up again? Right. And so not getting into the neurophysiology of how we expend our serotonin and all that kind of stuff, and why we reach to sugar, and why we reach to caffeine, and why we reach to drugs and alcohol and stuff like that to give us supernatural powers. When we're drained, right? But we get this illusion through those substances that we have energy left after. Really starting from a young age, looking at transition rituals is an important thing. So what I mean by transition rituals is, how do we move from our role as a student into our role as a sister, brother, daughter, et cetera, into moving into our role as a partner, a girlfriend, boyfriend at those ages, into how we move into that space of, now I'm an employee for the next 8 hours, into that space back into, how am I going to be a student? And for me, I had no boundaries between all those roles that I played for many, many years. I was just, and this is part of our preamble, there was no like to-do list. There was just just keep going, right? Never mind identifying where my head's at and where my feet are at, and if they're in the same room, right? I often would drag some of my personal life into work, right? If I had a bad time with my boyfriend or my mom when I was young, that was absolutely going to affect how I worked. And if I had a bad day at work, that was absolutely going to affect how I talked to my mom or dad when I walked in the house that night, right? So creating these little transition rituals, even if they're just a moment of like meditation or a moment of mindfulness where it's like, okay, now where am I? Where am I heading? Right. And instead of dragging the whole day with you home, every bad or good thing that happened to you that day, you're able to like, okay, and now I'm in this space, and now I'm in this space, and now I'm in this space. I'm not sure if that answered your question, but that is something I wish I knew how to do back then, 30 years ago, that I'm just learning now how to do. And that's actually what, again, not to paint this all gloom and doom, that's what gives me hope. The young people who I've met with, either in the high school culinary school programs that are preparing them to go out directly into the workplace, or youth that I've been working with in culinary schools in the past couple of years talking about mental health. Youth is so much more aware of mental health and so much more open about what they're talking about. They really are teaching us, and by us, I mean people over 30, over 40 even. The youth are teaching the elders right now, and I absolutely think it's a great thing. I don't think that that's messed up or out of order, or some people push back on that, like that we know what we need to know. What could we possibly learn from youth? No, I admire and respect youth for what they're learning in public schools and private schools right now, even sometimes what they're learning on social media about who they are and building identity around that versus building identity around what they do or how they produce at school or perform in athletics and that kind of stuff. I have so much respect and admiration for youth today. More than I think I was given as a youth. Yeah, for sure.
So you kind of mentioned, hey, like the stuff that you struggle with when you're a teen or a young adult, it's the same stuff that you're struggling with when you're an adult. So it comes down to balance, right? And you mentioned specifically, hey, I don't have this checklist, right? Like there is no way for me to know, like, oh, here are some tools. Like here are some steps I can take. Here are some best practices. So let's talk about that. If I want to support somebody who's in the restaurant industry or the hospitality industry, so that they don't fall into substance abuse, or so that mental health challenges don't become something that kind of like steer their life in the direction that they don't want it to go. What are the steps that a loved one can take, or that a person can take, to be able to overcome these challenges or to anticipate them?
So the first thing I can think of is healthy peer-to-peer support. So minding your company that you keep, is it draining you, or is it filling you on a daily basis? Are the people that you hang around with, one of the quipisms is this person filling your cup or filling your cup? So being around people who pour positive affirmations into you, right, gives you that opportunity to pour that into others. And we know that there are positive mental health effects from helping others, but we can't help others if we're empty ourselves, right? So the first thing I would say is be mindful of who you keep company with. Make sure that they're positive influences on your mental health and not negative ones. Another would be connect with a mental health professional as soon as possible, right? For instance, if you've ever had anybody in your family, or if you've personally experienced a cancer diagnosis, the first thing the doctor wants to know is if you've been looked at before, if you've had a mammogram, or if you've had an exam in the past, right? Because we need to look at healthy tissue first in order to know when something has fallen ill, how long it's been growing, or how big the tumor's gotten, and things like that. So connecting with a mental health therapist on a good day, so that the mental health therapist can ask you, what are you doing right now to support this positive picture of mental health I see before me? And then when the day is not going so well and you reach out, they're like, what slipped out of play? What practice did we put down that allowed this negative thing to enter instead in its place, right? So seeking mental health professionals early is a great thing. Having somebody around, whether it's a mentor who's older than you by many, many years, or having a mentor around who's just a step ahead of you, right? The Big Brothers Big Sisters Foundation is a great organization to reach out to. There's many recovery community organizations that have peer support professionals of various ages and stages in recovery themselves, who can help somebody who might be just concerned right now about how much alcohol or drugs they consume. Maybe it hasn't become a problem for them yet. Maybe it hasn't evolved into dependence or even addiction, but it's somebody to talk to who's been where you've been. The value of peer support is shared lived experiences. So this is one of the reasons why between parents and children there's often a great disconnect, is because the child has no shared lived experience of what it is to be a parent, right? But the parent has had an experience of being the child. So when children reach out to mentors within close ages to them, and we're talking as early as 8 years old, right? And sometimes even earlier than that, there's a freedom, a fluidity of conversation that can't occur when you're trying to explain something to somebody who's got to reach back into the annals of their mind to figure, okay, what was I like when I was 8? Was I experiencing, that kind of thing. So yeah, really peer support, whether it comes in the shape of a professional or just somebody in your neighborhood or in your school. That's what I would say is the biggest thing that anybody could do to promote good mental health.
Does CHOW have support groups for people in the restaurant and hospitality industry?
We do. So we have right now currently 4 meetings a week. One is hybrid, the rest are online, which has allowed us to reach out to people in different states. We're based here in Denver. I just moved here from Minnesota, as a matter of fact, because I was so attracted by the mission that CHOW was on. I decided to come in and work for them. But we've got people calling in from British Columbia. We've got people calling in from Louisiana, from New York, from Maine, even from Australia one night. So the virtual platform has really allowed us to help as many people as we can. So we've got that on Monday nights at 6 and Wednesday nights at 7. And then we've also got an all women's group. Anybody who identifies as a woman can join us on Tuesdays at 4 o'clock online. That may be changing in October because the folks who attend most frequently have said they'd like to see a morning meeting so that they can attend before they go to work to sort of start their day right. And then we also have a Spanish speaking group that meets on Tuesday evenings, and that's supported by our partners at LARA Recovery, which stands for Latino Advocacy or Latino Recovery Advocacy.org. And they're really doing great things, again, to bust that stigma, especially within the Latina and Latinx community, that it's not okay to talk about your mental health. We're really supporting that it is okay to talk about your mental health. And they're great partners in that. And we hope to expand more. We hope to have groups led by youth who are interested in the restaurant industry, whether they're in a high school program right now for culinary arts or in a college program for culinary arts, because again, students have an experience. They have a shared lived experience that maybe somebody who's been in the industry for 30 or 40 years can't connect to. It's just too much of a mental gymnastics to get there. So we're hoping to form a group for youth and then really industry vets. If somebody from the industry vet community would like to come and start a group for folks who aren't in the restaurant industry anymore, but are still affected by the chaos and the dysfunction of the multiple decades they worked in the industry, they're welcome to do that as well. Really, CHOW just wants to connect people with other people as well as we can.
So I love all of the different ways you guys are helping people out. And listeners, watchers, we're going to make sure that we link to all of those different groups and their times and the specific schedules and stuff in the show notes with the description box below. So if you know somebody who's in the industry, right? And they need some support group and they want to be around people who really get them, who understand exactly what they're going through and who can relate to their struggle and to the awesomeness of being in the restaurant and the hospitality industry, then this is an amazing resource to be able to connect them with. And, just to summarize what I heard you say is like, this is actually a really interesting way to express it is like, hey, why don't you have a session with a mental health professional while things are going well, so you have a baseline, right? So that like this is what I look like when I'm feeling mentally strong, right? When I'm not abusing substances or whatever. And then if there's a challenging situation, right? Like, or if you're going through something, then you're better able to be helped by that person because they have a baseline from where you're at, right? Which I love that. It's great. And the second thing is just kind of echoing what you mentioned earlier is, hey, have a peer support group. Have a group of people who can relate to your struggles and your goals and be able to connect with them, even if it's remotely, so that you understand that you're not alone, so that you feel understood, right? Melinda, where can people go to learn more about CHOW?
So they can head to www.chowco.org. That's CHOWCO.org. And on there, they'll find that we offer a rewards program for folks celebrating their self-care. So if you walked your dog today, if you sang a song, if you engaged your hobbies, you earn points towards cool CHOW swag like, yoga mats and plant kits and t-shirts and Sharpie markers and things like that. So definitely check that out. We're also offering mental health training free to anybody in the restaurant community. And we discuss things like healthy communication, mental health, substance use, and just how to identify what balance is besides this teeter-totter thing that most media will present balance as. We see balance as an intersection of many different facets of your life. And so we talk about how to assess that answer to that question that people ask you all the time, like, how are you doing? Well, how do we measure that? We actually give folks a way to measure that. And then also, if somebody is in the state of Colorado or Texas, if any of the listeners are from those two states, CHOW is able to connect you to a mental health professional at no or low cost, thanks to our partners at Kesed Wellness. And then finally, we offer our meetings 4 nights a week, hopefully more coming soon. And you're absolutely welcome to reach out to me or Erin, our executive director. You can find our emails on the CHOWCO website to find out more information about how you can bring a CHOW meeting to your community.
Awesome. Well, Melinda, it has been an absolute pleasure. I've learned so much. Thank you for telling us all about not only your own experience, but also, the state of the restaurant and hospitality industry and kind of expanding those genres a little bit, if you will. Thank you so much for being on the podcast.
It's been my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Listeners, you can again see all of those links that Melinda was talking about in the description box or the show notes below. And until then, we will see you on the next episode. Bye. If you want to learn more about treatment options for you, your teen, or young adult, then tell us about your situation on a confidential call using the number in the show notes or live chat with us at sandstonecare.com. We'll connect you with the treatment that you need, and if we're not the right fit, will get you where you need to go. Be well, and remember that change is possible.